Hi everybody, thank you for joining me once again as I continue to examine Norman Geisler and Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist from an Atheist Perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapter 12 of the book, which is titled, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead? And I won't keep you in suspense as to what the answer to that question is. We'll just dive right in. Geisler and Turek open this chapter by quoting Gary Habermas, who is a fellow apologist who specializes in the resurrection of Jesus, and he's someone who they return to several times throughout this chapter. But they open with a quote from Habermas that reads, quote, "Skeptics must provide more than alternative theories to the resurrection. They must provide first-century evidence for those theories." Well, actually, Gary, skeptics don't even need to provide alternative theories. All they need are reasons to doubt the theory that Jesus rose from the dead. For instance, if someone tells me today that they saw Elvis Presley at a gas station yesterday, I don't need to be able to provide a comprehensive, conclusive alternative explanation of what they saw to know with confidence that whatever it is, or whoever it was that they saw, it was not Elvis. And Habermas, in that quote, and Geisler and Turek throughout this book, and especially in this chapter we're going to talk about, is trying to get away with the old apologist trick of shifting the burden of proof. According to Habermas, his theory that Jesus was the Son of God who rose from the dead following his crucifixion is the default explanation for those events or for those claims, and we ought to presume that it is true until it is proven false to Habermas's satisfaction, which, given the credulity with which he regards this particular claim, is a highly unlikely circumstance. So now, that's the opening quote of the chapter. Let's get into the chapter proper with a first section titled, The Resurrection, What Do Scholars Say? Geisler and Turek report that Habermas, in his book The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, the title of a sober scholarly work, if ever I heard one, reports broad agreement among biblical scholars across the ideological spectrum on the following 12 facts about Jesus and his death and resurrection. Fact number 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. 2, he was buried, most likely in a private tomb. 3, soon afterwards, the disciples were discouraged, bereaved, and despondent, having lost hope. 4, Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. 5, the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. 6, due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. 7, the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early from the beginnings of church history. 8, the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. 9, the gospel message centered on the preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus. 10, Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worshiping. 11, James, the brother of Jesus and a skeptic before this time, was converted when he believed he also saw the risen Jesus. 12, just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, that would be Paul, became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, notice 2 things about that list of 12 facts. First, the source for almost all of the 12 is the New Testament itself. Second, none of these 12 facts require us to believe in the divinity of Jesus in order to accept them as facts. I could grant Geisler and Turek every single one of those dozen facts and still be every bit the atheist I am now. They make no difference whatsoever. It is a completely irrelevant list to proving the divinity of Jesus. But using these 12 facts, Geisler and Turek reiterate 3 claims about the New Testament that they have made previously in this book. First, that the New Testament story is not a legend. And this, they say, because the New Testament was written too soon after the actual events, because the storyline is corroborated by non-Christian sources, and because they contain numerous historical figures, verifiable historical figures. For these reasons, it cannot be a legend, they say. But of course, all three of these reasons are bogus because, as we have previously discussed and very briefly, the too soon to be legendary argument is based on a misinterpretation of A.N. Sherwin White and is easily demonstrated to be untrue. The non-Christian sources only confirm what stories about Jesus people were telling, not whether or not those stories are true. And the number of actual historical figures appearing in the stories is irrelevant. Barack Obama appeared in a Spider-Man comic a few years ago. That doesn't mean we should all start believing in Spider-Man. The next claim they make about the New Testament based on those 12 facts is that the New Testament story is not a lie. And this, they argue, on the basis of the presence of embarrassing and divergent details, facts that would have been verifiable by readers of the time, and the martyrdom of the disciples, which Geisler and Turek argue should remove any doubt of their veracity. As we discussed in the previous video in this series, none of these things are sufficient for us to accept that the New Testament's outlandish claims about Jesus, and particularly the events following his death, are true. Next, they say the New Testament story is not an embellishment. And this, they argue, based on the accurate and meticulous nature with which the New Testament writers record the events they depict and how they record miracles in the same matter-of-fact style. As I said in the previous video, even if we share Geisler and Turek's interpretation of the Gospels as a dry, matter-of-fact style without embellishment, a preposterous story told with a straight face is still a preposterous story, and the outlandish claims about Jesus in the New Testament remain just as outlandish, no matter what tone or style in which they are delivered to us. So, Geisler and Turek ask, is the New Testament true? Well, not to continue to hold you in suspense, but before they get to their answer to that question, which is already patently obvious, they claim that skeptics still have one more arrow in their quiver, as it were. That is the claim that the New Testament writers were sincere but deceived. And that is certainly one possibility to explain the New Testament, although it's far from the only one that skeptics have left after the force of these arguments, or even the best one. Also, remember, once again, that strictly speaking, the New Testament writers need not have been deceived by anything they saw, because they didn't actually see anything they were writing about. No one who actually knew Jesus contributed anything to the New Testament. The disciples and the writers of the New Testament are different groups of people. The disciples did not write the New Testament. Next section, skeptical about skeptical theories. Geisler and Turek enumerate and ultimately dismiss 7 theories that seek to account for the resurrection of Jesus without accepting the New Testament accounts as true. First, hallucination theory. Perhaps the disciples merely thought they had seen the risen Jesus, but they were actually hallucinating. Geisler and Turek reject this idea for 2 reasons. First, hallucinations don't affect large groups of people simultaneously, and Jesus' resurrection appearances were witnessed by hundreds of people. Second, people saw the empty tomb, which must have been real, because if it had not been real, Roman authorities could have simply displayed the body of Jesus and squashed Christianity before it ever had a chance to take hold. Well, there may not be such a thing as a collective hallucination per se, but there is definitely such a thing as a collective delusion, or what is also sometimes called mass hysteria or collective hysteria. Crowds of people may not have had hundreds of simultaneous, vivid, realistic visions of Jesus, but they could have all come under the impression that they had seen Jesus, or more generally, that Jesus was alive following his execution. For an example of this, look no further than modern Christian miracle crusades, where thousands of people can leave believing that they have witnessed healings and in some cases even resurrections, when in reality they have seen nothing of the kind. Much more basically, the source for the post-resurrection appearances, for the hundreds of eyewitnesses, for the existence of the empty tomb, is the New Testament itself. Imagine if I demanded that you provide an alternative theory to Clark Kent being the secret identity of Superman. You could subject the relative comic books to a very close reading and highlight particular details to support whatever theory you were proposing, or you could point out that this is a very silly argument to be having in the first place. Next theory, the witnesses went to the wrong tomb. Maybe the disciples just visited the wrong tomb and they saw that it was empty and immediately just jumped to the conclusion, hopefully, that Jesus had risen. This can't be true, said Geisler and Turek, because if the body of Jesus were still in its tomb, the Romans would have used it to discredit Christianity from the very beginning. Quote, as William Lane Craig notes, the wrong tomb theory assumes that all of the Jews and the Romans had a permanent kind of collective amnesia about what they had done with the body of Jesus. Sounds a little bit like the collective amnesia that must have been experienced by everyone in Jerusalem who witnessed dead Jewish saints rising from their graves and walking the streets of Jerusalem, appearing to countless people. And then they said absolutely nothing about it to anyone ever again. That kind of collective amnesia. Also, wouldn't that kind of collective amnesia, even if that were hypothetically speaking the only possible explanation other than the resurrection, still be a more plausible explanation than the resurrection? Quote, second, even if the disciples did go to the wrong tomb, the theory does not explain how the risen Jesus appeared 12 different times. In other words, the appearances must be explained, not just the empty tomb. And if you want to argue that Clark Kent isn't Superman, you have to account for where Clark was during the time when Superman was dead following his fight with Doomsday. Next is swoon theory. This is the theory that says perhaps Jesus didn't actually die on the cross at all, but only appeared to die, lost consciousness, and then he regained consciousness later in his tomb, thus appearing to rise from the dead, when in fact he had never been dead at all. Geisler and Turek tick off numerous reasons why the swoon theory doesn't hold up, mostly having to do with how grievously injured Jesus would have been following the crucifixion, even if he had somehow survived. And there was an entire chapter in The Case for Christ about this, if you watch that series or you've read that book. But they save their best objection to swoon theory for last. Quote, the swoon theory cannot explain Jesus' bright light appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus. Well, it can't explain Jesus' appearance to American Indians in the Book of Mormon either, so I guess that it really is just right out. Next, the theory that the disciples stole the body. Geisler and Turek reject this theory because it doesn't cast the New Testament writers as the deceived, but rather as the deceivers. Quote, this of course flies in the face of all the evidence we've seen so far. The theory takes the untenable position that the New Testament writers were all liars. No, it takes the position that the disciples were liars. As we've already discussed ad nauseum to this point, the disciples were not the writers of the New Testament. Next theory, a substitute took Jesus' place on the cross. In other words, the Romans crucified the wrong guy. This, Geisler and Turek note, is the explanation preferred by Muslims, and this is the explanation found in the Quran. Quote, there are a number of problems with this theory, not the least being that there's absolutely no evidence to back it up. Say the guys who insist that the real explanation is that Jesus was the Son of God who worked miracles and was resurrected 3 days after his death, and who then appeared to hundreds of people before subsequently being lifted up into heaven, where he has remained, sending not so much as a postcard for the last 2,000 years. Next, the disciples' faith led their belief in the resurrection. And this theory is favored by John Dominic Crossan and the Jesus Seminar, and it holds that the disciples invented the story of the resurrection because they believed in Jesus so much that they refused to accept that he was dead. And they welcomed their persecution for those beliefs at the hands of the authorities because they came to regard that persecution as the inevitable fate of God's chosen people. And they took that as confirmation that they had been chosen by God, the fact that they were being persecuted. Geisler and Turek reject this because they say the disciples were devastated following Jesus' death, and they were in no frame of mind to invent a resurrection story to carry on the ministry of a Jesus they knew to be dead. Again, the only sources for information about the disciples following the death of Jesus are the Gospels themselves, the very documents whose legitimacy as historical sources is being questioned, the very documents whose origins we are attempting to account for with these arguments. How can you possibly cite them as sources for the mindset of the disciples, etc., when they are the very documents under examination? It's absolutely circular. It makes no sense at all. Next, the New Testament writers copied pagan resurrection myths. Geisler and Turek reject this theory because the New Testament isn't written like a myth. And also because the myth theory doesn't account for the empty tomb and the martyrdom of the disciples or the non-Christian sources. We've already been over all of these things previously. The New Testament's claims about Jesus are just as preposterous, no matter whether they are written in what Geisler and Turek consider to be an appropriate style for a myth or not. And the empty tomb and the circumstances of the persecution and martyrdom of the disciples are claims of the church that we have no reason to treat as facts in the first place. Next section, do you have any evidence for that? Do skeptics have first century evidence for their alternative theories accounting for the resurrection? Quote, "No one from the ancient world, not even the enemies of Christianity, has offered a plausible alternative explanation for the resurrection." So, does that mean if no one can offer a plausible alternative explanation for where the golden plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated came from, we must accept that the Book of Mormon is, in fact, another testament of Jesus Christ and become members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? See, in order to require a plausible alternative explanation to a theory, you must first have a plausible theory. And the resurrection of Jesus is not a plausible theory. Next section, why don't all scholars believe? Geisler and Turek begin this section by asking this remarkable question, quote, "Why don't all scholars take the New Testament at face value?" Never mind that it's probably a bad idea for serious historians to just accept the information found in any historical document at face value. How do Geisler and Turek answer their own question? Well, they say, quote, "For the same reason Darwinists refuse to acknowledge the evidence that defeats their view. They have a philosophical bias against miracles." Geisler and Turek continue to treat skepticism about miracles as something arbitrary, rather than something based on an understanding of science and history and just, how things work in general. Quote, "They arrive at the wrong conclusion because their bias makes it impossible for them to arrive at the right conclusion. Their projection is getting so on the nose at this point that if I didn't know they were such giant shitheads as they are, I'd think they were doing it on purpose." Next section, context, context, context. It's like the English student version of Torah, Torah, Torah. Geisler and Turek endorse a skeptical attitude toward claims of miracles. Yes, they actually do. They say that just because something is said to be a miracle doesn't mean that we should just automatically assume that it is. But that doesn't mean that no event can ever be a miracle. For example, let's just pick one totally at random, the resurrection of Jesus. Geisler and Turek argue that when judging whether or not this event was a miracle, we should consider the context, specifically 4 areas of the context. First, the theistic nature of the universe makes miracles possible. Geisler and Turek are assuming this, but of course they have failed to provide compelling arguments for the universe being theistic, so we can sweep that aside. Number two, ancient documents say miracles are to be expected. And by ancient documents, they mean the Old Testament. Now we have not only the New Testament, but the Old Testament being entered into evidence. Three, historically confirmed eyewitness documents say miracles are actual. And by historically confirmed eyewitness documents, they mean the New Testament, which has not been historically confirmed by eyewitnesses, but it says miracles actually happened. Therefore, according to Geisler and Turek's logic, miracles must have actually happened. For additional confirmation, non-Christian sources confirm the storyline of the New Testament, so they say, but once again, for what feels like the billionth time, this just isn't true. A smattering of brief references in a relatively few non-Christian sources confirm what early Christians believed, not what actually happened. The story being told is confirmed, but not whether or not the story is true. That is a hugely important distinction that Geisler and Turek just absolutely refuse to recognize. Next section, extraordinary claims and self-canceling evidence. Geisler and Turek object to skeptical demands for extraordinary evidence for the resurrection and for miracles in general. They spend over 2 pages of the remainder of this chapter playing around with the definition of extraordinary. Quote, "This objection seems reasonable until you ask, what does extraordinary mean? If it means beyond the natural, then the skeptic is asking the resurrection to be confirmed by another miracle. How could that work? In order to believe in the first miracle, the skeptic would then need a second miracle to support it. He would then need a third miracle to support the second, and this would go on to infinity." Actually, evidence that miracles occur at all would be a good start, and just by itself would instantly increase the plausibility of the claims about the resurrection. And demonstrating that miracles are real things that actually happen doesn't require an infinite regress of miracles. It requires one miracle, one single event that cannot be explained as anything other than a miracle would be sufficient evidence that miracles do in fact occur, and that a miracle such as the resurrection is at least hypothetically possible. Quote, "Furthermore, skeptics don't demand extraordinary evidence for other extraordinary events from history. For example, few events from ancient history are more extraordinary than the accomplishments of Alexander the Great." True, but our knowledge of Alexander the Great doesn't come from reading what was written about him and taking it at face value, as Geisler and Turek want us to take the New Testament. Our knowledge of Alexander comes from reading sources critically, so that the probable facts can be separated from the probable fictions. That's why aspects of Alexander's history, such as his military conquests and the reach of his empire, are generally agreed upon and accepted by historians, while the legend that he was a child of Zeus is not. Geisler and Turek also address the notion of miracles being self-canceling, since all religions claim to have miracles. Quote, "As we've seen since chapter 9, the miracles associated with Christianity are not based on poor testimony. They are based on early eyewitness, multiple source testimony that is unrivaled in any other world religion. That is, no other world religion has verified miracles like those in the New Testament. In other words, our miracles are better than their miracles." Somehow I suspect if we were to ask an apologist from one of those other world religions to address this topic, he or she would see things somewhat differently. And finally, next section, conclusion. One solitary life. The authors end the chapter by quoting from the One Solitary Life sermon written by James Allen Francis, which trumpets the influence Jesus has had on humanity despite his humble beginnings and short life. And then Geisler and Turek say, quote, "If there was no resurrection, How could this life be the most influential life of all time? We don't have enough faith to believe that this one solitary life from a remote ancient village could be the most influential life of all time unless the resurrection is true. The problem isn't that they don't have enough faith. The problem from the very beginning of the book has been that they have far, far too much. That's it for this chapter. I will be back in the next video in this series to review chapter 13 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And chapter 13 is titled, Who is Jesus? God or just a great moral teacher? Getting into the C.S. Lewis area now. I guess they're getting tired of ripping off Lee Strobel, so now they're going to rip off C.S. Lewis for a bit. That'll be a nice change of pace. So, that's the next video. That's it for this video. Thank you, as always, for watching. Thank you for commenting, for engaging, for being interested in this, for finding this to be useful or entertaining or whatever it is to you. I greatly appreciate it. Please feel free to leave a comment about anything you've heard me say, argue with me, make a point I was trying to make better than I made it, whatever. I love to read any response you would have. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I will see you in the next video in this series.